Welcome and thanks for tuning in to the Victorian Aboriginal News Van Talks podcast. I'm your host, Charles Pakana.
Victorian Aboriginal News acknowledges and pays respect to all traditional owners and custodians across Australia. We acknowledge the elders who have gone before, those who currently lead their communities, and those who will follow in the years and generations to come.
Joining me in the studio today is a fairly amazing man. He is a mixture of saltwater nations, Larrakia and Wadjagan, and a desert nation, the Central Aranda. He's got also family ties right across Aboriginal nations of the Northern Territory. He's served as the chair of the Northern Territory Aboriginal Justice Advisory Committee and chair of the Northern Australia Aboriginal Justice Agency. On top of all that, he's also served as the Anti-Discrimination Commissioner of the Northern Territory and currently, even though on sabbatical, works as a professor at the Melbourne Law School. His name, Eddie Cubillo. Eddie, thanks so much indeed for joining us on the program today, brother.
Thanks for having me, Uncle.
So, Eddie, the reason you're here is that late last year I received from Melbourne University Press an advanced copy of Defending the Defenceless, which really dove into, from my reading, self-determination in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander legal systems. Really keen to talk about that and some of the key points that arose from that. First of all, Eddie, let's start off with understanding a bit about your background and your path to becoming a bit of a powerhouse in First Nations law.
So, my nations are the Larrakia, Wadjagan and Central Aranda. My family have lands under the Land Rights Act and the native title under Central Aranda Mob. Larrakia, unfortunately, hasn't been successful in that space at the moment. So straight away, as a First Nations person, as you'd know, we're born into politics and all that stuff we grow up on it. And I was always going to land council meetings and, discussing issues and that. And I had kids at a young age.
You were 19 or so,
19,
weren't you?
20, yeah. And my aspirations to go on to finish studies and that dried up at that time. But
well, actually, just before you go there, because we're passing over something important, and that is, even when you decided to go on and do Year 12, you were actually teased a bit at that, weren't you? Being called a bit of a white fella, is that right?
Yeah, my brothers and that, they were just a little bit of a hard time, but they worked on country, At the time, there was a buffalo eradication program on, and they were working as, stockmen and rounding up the buffalo and all sorts of stuff, on our own country. So, it was opportunity to have work, but my mum really pushed me to go back and to do Year 12, and I got through and was looking at higher ed, but I had kids and I wouldn't change it for anything. They're probably the best thing that I'd done. I went to work then, and then I went back as a mature age student at 27. I was doing a social work degree, and then one of my lecturers basically said, maybe you're in the wrong degree.
Head off into law, brother.
Yeah, and but I think looking back, we get skilled working in our communities and that, how we relate to one another and how we can read the play and all that.
Yeah.
And social work, I think the interpersonal skills and that I picked up whilst doing 2 years of that really assisted me in going to my next stages of my life with studying law and getting on Aboriginal Legal Service Board and then becoming chair of it. I also was a chair of the Yiliriang Regional ATSIC Council up north, and just after my law degree, I was on the last episode of ATSIC, which was really eye-opening for me insofar as that I got the opportunity to not only engage with the elders on my regional council, but all the other regional councils within the territory, going to state gatherings and that, but also got to interact nationally and meeting some really quality First Nations people from around the country and actually learning from them as well, how their governance structures work and how they were working internally on their regional councils. And so it really gave me a bigger perspective on us as First Nations people, right? We all have our different engagement with colonisation, and a lot of us had the wrath of it at the start and a lot harder than others. And so that always made me understand where we were going. And I thought at that time, we were making a few inroads up north with our regional councils. We initially agreed to do the review of our ATSI because we thought 10 years and it's good to review our businesses and that.
Yeah.
And I think the review came back that they'd reshape it a bit but be more community focused on the regional councils. And we were supportive of that. But John Howard, in the book, I say how he basically, first thing he came in was to attack the ATSI.
And we'll get onto that, but I want to dive back into the legal services. And I think it's an important lesson for Australians to understand something that they take for granted, which is that free shopfront legal service actually came about, as Dr. Gary Foley has said in the foreword to your book, as a result of Aboriginal activism. Just give us a little bit of a picture of how that all started.
He basically was saying that after the referendum...
That's the 1967 referendum, of course.
Everybody came off the missions and headed into Redfern. There was like a flux of 30,000 that went in there, you know.
Yeah, it went from about 1,500 people in Redfern up to about nearly 40,000 or so.
Like 30, 35, 40. You know, obviously social issues and everything came in. He said that the police would fix the crime rate by every end of the month. They'd come into a hotel and grab anyone out of there and, you know, bash them and take them away. Right? And
this led also to the adaptation of the Black Panther movement's pig patrols that were prevalent in, California?
Yeah, well, Professor Foley said that they were all young fellows, and him, Paul Coe, and various others. They made allowships with the African Americans who were inshore in Sydney at the time, and sharing some of their paraphernalia around the Black Panthers, what they were doing in the US. And Gary and others, they went over and had a visit and checked out what they were doing and basically influenced the Aboriginal legal service.
But this was the very first shopfront legal service in the country.
Yeah.
Not black, not white, nothing. It was the very first. Yet it's something we all take for granted in this country right now, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. The reality is it came out of need for Indigenous community, right?
Yeah.
They saw a need. They see now people being harassed and violently treated by the police and by our state legislators. And so they got the dean of the UNSW and took him to the pub and just to show him what went down. He'd been there an hour or so, and he was the only non-Indigenous person on the other side of the bar. And he was like, "Oh, I got to go see what's going on." And I said, "Well, just wait.
Just wait for closing time.
Just wait for 7 o'clock, and it'll be all done." Dead on 7 or something like that. The police bands would rock up everywhere and just come in and grab people and just take them. And Gary himself expressed that he'd been one of those bashed and taken by police.
That's right, yeah.
And, you know, at the time there was all this corruption going on, and they had the big Royal Commission into it as well. And so the dean was shocked. He was freaking out, and he'd try to get up and do the social justice thing, and they would say, no, just watch, because no one believes us. And so that's basically how they got him involved, and also others, to start that shopfront.
You talk a lot about, in the book, self-determination.
Yep.
You touch on various definitions of self-determination as it plays out across various sectors. But let's talk about self-determination in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander legal system, or ATSILs. From your work, from your studies, from your endless number of interviews and development of case studies, what's your definition of true self-determination in the ATSILs environment? And the smile is telling me that it's an ongoing solution.
Yeah, it's not what works in the Northern Territory doesn't necessarily work in Central Northern Territory, do you know what I mean? So every state and region is different.
But there must be some common threads.
Professor Foley, he points that the initiation of the ALS was community thought and community govern.
Yeah.
And it wasn't derived out of a Royal Commission or a pilot program or anything like that, right? So that's the very essence of that substance, right, where it comes from. It's a community initiative, and it was a real need, and it derived out of that. And he's a bit critical of it, saying that's no longer that, right? He said once we took some money, we started to get a Bible of government rules and regulations. And that.
So immediately we took the money, we were beholden to the government.
Yeah, and that's evolved, right? I was the EO of the national body for 6 years, and every year finances were always questioned and whether they were going to fund certain programs and threaten our orgs, whether they could do advocacy. There was even questions in Senate estimates around what's advocacy, and former Attorney General said it's just being in court on your feet, nothing else. We all know that's wrong, and research tells us advocacy, it's at the front end to really make change. At the back end where we're in court, it's too late, right? And so these are the ever ongoing fights that the ALS do. And I did interview 22 odd people who are all related to the ALS in some way, either legal or member of council or a long-time staff member.
Yeah.
And most of them said they're not self-determining and they're not community control. And they're saying that because they've been forced into incorporation really quickly at one time in history, and they didn't really have time to really sit down and work out their governance structures at that time. They had to get basically something off the shelf and then apply for the tender. And some states had to amalgamate, like I think Queensland had like 17, and they amalgamated into 2 and then 1. And that goes against all the self-determining practices of we don't all speak for one another, you know. And so the Northern Territory went in from, I think, 4 or 3 to 2, then 1.
Yeah.
As you know, we're all diverse, right? I mean, Victoria's a small state, but it's very diverse with its nations, right? Everyone's similar but different. The biggest issues that most people said, it's government and it's the accountability, the purse strings and the pressures that they put on them. And I think also, I think most of the Australian community really doesn't know the legal process and systems, the process of the court system, and the very limited financial, that our orgs have, and that they provide such a huge service with very limited dollars. There's a toll there somewhere, and it's usually our staff burn out or working really long hours. And so something's got to give. And I think for the amount of money they do, and this is real, when they went to tender, no one else tendered for them.
So what's, in your opinion, and asking you to maybe sort of draw on those opinions of the 22 people you interviewed for this particular book, what is needed, apart from the obvious going back to true community control within the ALS, the Aboriginal Legal Service System, to achieve that self-determining, to go back to the grassroots?
Funding is obviously one. If we had our own money, we could run our services however we want, right?
Sure.
As always, Aboriginal people, or Indigenous people, we work within structures that we make them work for us, even though they don't suit us and no one recognises our governing structures. And there's bias that most government public servants don't trust us, thinking everyone's trying to rip off something.
Yeah.
So it's hard to work under those hostile conditions, right? But these organisations are doing that. And it's not like the old days. They've got CFOs who are qualified. They've got Indigenous lawyers in these places, Indigenous CEOs who are highly qualified in that. But it's just the complex of federalism and state jurisdiction around crime is a real problem. Closing the gap's failing. It's failing justice. And the reality is this, right? The other day we had an apology, but out-of-home care is through the roof, right? Apology is supposed to mean something, that we won't do it again. It's continuing on, right?
Yeah.
And it's under guises of these legislations that really impact on our people and other low socioeconomic groups. And so these states and territories have signed up to an agreement saying they'll meet these KPIs, but there's no intentions of doing that.
Well, one of the things you make mention of in the book is that it seems that one of the problems in addressing some of the inherent problems is the fact that Aboriginal legal services don't really seem to be at the table with the government addressing specific concerns and addressing specific issues when it comes to the 35+% of Aboriginal people in incarceration, when it comes to the substantive legal system inherently working against Indigenous people. What's needed, do you see, with regard to getting ALS to the table and for the government to listen? That's a fairly broad question for you.
Well, the reality is the current structures ain't working.
Yep.
Right? And our organisations, whether it be health or whatever, we're trying to work in these
white constructs?
Yeah, and we're doing the best we can with the very limited dollars that they get, right? But states and territories, in a justice sense, are constantly ignoring what they've said they're going to do, and they're breaching it by making bail, sentencing, and all of these areas. Making tough on bail, tough on crime policies are basically making the statistics go through the roof, right? So they're not actually trying to adhere to what they've said they're going to do and close the gap. And it's about time now that the feds, under the Constitution, have a look at how they can pull them all into line. And I think we're getting past it now, where just recently, as I mentioned before, the apology, you've got to sit back and think, what's going on if that's out of hand, as well as incarceration. Our women are the fastest growing group.
You mentioned that in the book, yeah.
And if our men are already in prison, who's looking after our kids? And we're ripping them out anyway. So it's a real dire situation. And again, it's fairly complex, but no one really wants to put their hand up to actually do anything, right? I mean, with out-of-home care, Australia's responded to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the feds could make some law around that to impose on states and territories, right? But tough on crime wins elections, right? So
it's very much an election catch crime.
Yeah, until we get that out of there, we're never going to really pull this up. And I've worked for the Indigenous Legal Services, but I also worked for Australian Legal Aid in the Northern Territory.
Yeah.
Did my articles there and did a couple of years of working there. When people go through criminal matters, they're frightened just as much as anyone, right? No one really knows that space unless you actually work in there and do that, right? And our orgs are pretty well, experienced and have really skilled people in them, and we skilled up a whole heap of non-Indigenous people over the years, right? But it comes back to states and territories in regards to the justice space. And it's time now that the feds considered whether they are going to stand up and do something.
When you say the feds to stand up and do something, what would Eddie Cubillo like to see happen from the feds?
I've recently resigned off the JPP because I just...
Sorry, JPP being...
The Justice Policy Partnership, which is the committee that advises Close the Gap.
Yep.
And I was an independent member, and I just got tired of us going and have a chinwag, and basically we could see, all of us could see the states and territories going the opposite way, right? And it's not easy for the public sector who work and come to those meetings, but eventually someone has to stand up, and it's not happening. And it's a bit of a worry, and we can't afford to lose these organisations because there'll be a big gap then. Everyone knows that. They know the courts were shut down if the ATSLs were no longer around.
But they also can't afford to say no to government funding, regardless of the constraints that may be presented to them under. Surely.
Well, that's a bit of the discussion in the book, right?
Yeah.
They're now service providers in a sense, right?
Yeah.
And that's because of the funding, right? And don't get me wrong, a lot of them are still trying to advocate and do the right thing.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And some are doing wonderful jobs under the hostile conditions that they work. But the reality is, you can't begrudge them if they're being threatened with their finances. Again, I'm not talking about getting rid of them, I'm just talking about what that looks like. And I use the voices of those that I interviewed to tell the story. It's not my personal view, it's just wanting to hear it from them.
You're the message stick, essentially, for a lot of those.
Yeah, look, I'm like a lot of us who've worked in these spaces. We burn out, and look, I worked on the Royal Commission in the Northern Territory, and I was pretty burnt out after that. For some silly reason, I did a PhD, right, and that's what I wrote about. And I grew up through that ALSs, and it nurtured me to where I am now in regards to who I am. But it's a service that has been around for 7 years now. It's our oldest Indigenous peak org in the country, right? But I say that maybe now it's time that they need to look in and re-establish themselves. And really, how do they, under the conditions they're in, do they still have legitimacy with community? And that's something for them to work out. Each of them need to sit down and see how they still can have community connected, because under current structures and that, the under incorporation under ASIC, you have a membership base, and a lot of those memberships ain't very big.
Or representative.
Yeah. But that's what they got forced into, and just their working environment is so full on and on the go every day that sometimes you just don't have the ability to pull up and say, hey, how do we continue connection with our communities, and is it working, and how do we constantly keep them informed of why we're doing this and all that. And it's not easy, right? A lot of them are doing good stuff. It's just about making sure that our communities are aware. Because I can tell you, as a former CEO, EO of the national body, I went to meetings and people were highly critical, But when you sat down and said to them, well, listen, this is the conditions that our ALSs are working under. We're currently fighting at the moment. At one time, they wanted to rip 75% out of our national funding. And these are some of the conditions that we're doing. And then we got state and territories enforcing tough on crime policies, which, make the workload even bigger. When people understand that, then they realise, right? And then also in regards to breaking it down for them about, oh, no, we're not pleading your son up or your daughter up or whatever. they've got a record already. The facts are these. I can't share to you what we actually know unless your son wants to waiver his confidence, and we can get right into it. So our community is pretty responsive in that sense, but it's just difficult when you're looking after people's liberty and you have to work flat out in the courts and you just don't have time to pull up for other things at times, and the book is about that, trying to just bring that up and hear what people have to say over the journey. It's a historical piece as well, how it started out, but also it's done from an Indigenous perspective, that someone who's worked in that space, who's grown up and who could have faced some of that stuff, out of home care and all of that, and just on that journey of that we all had that understanding or experience, I
think it's an important book for Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islanders and non-Indigenous peoples to read. It sheds light on so many important things. To finish up, though, with Eddie, I do want to touch on one thing, and it's something that's highlighted very early on in the book, and that is the fact that Australia's substantive legal system is inherently discriminatory against disenfranchised and disconnected communities. Just explain that a little bit, because you look at some of these laws and they say, well, okay, it's equal, it doesn't mention Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people, it's not intended to be discriminatory. But let's say like the Move On laws. How does that actually discriminate against First Nations peoples?
Again, I said, with those socioeconomic, historic, history of this country, of us being dispossessed of our lands, they know full well they're targeting us when they make those legislations. That's who they're targeting. And if there's some white fellas there or others who are homeless and on the streets, you'll get caught up in it as well. But it's predominantly our people, right? And there's other policies that then force us out of our homes because of our low socioeconomic. But it all comes back to the history of the dispossession of us and our lands, right? We had a decision in the High Court called Mabo, but basically recognising that they lied and that terra nullius is a lie, right? From there, it's basically saying then their legal system is on shaky grounds in our country, right? They've breached their own laws to set up this structure.
Sure.
And so from there on, until we really sit down and discuss that, because you can't really speak about it in law schools, people get a little bit uptight.
Oh, heaven forbid.
Yeah, right. And then students where I'm from, they claim to be the number one law school in this country, they know very little about us, right?
Yeah.
And they get taught this narrative about the legal system, how it's fair and just, right? So they don't really have any interaction or any real understanding of the legal system other than clarity around black and white letter law. But in fact, to the facts that the law was put into this country was unlawful. And we need to have that discussion, right?
Yeah.
And we need to teach the next generations on that, so that maybe in the future, when we are practicing law or we're sitting on the bench making a decision, we have a less biased view on this system, right?
We've got a long way to go.
Yeah, definitely. And I just come back from Canada and that, and you can almost do a law degree on Indigenous law in some of their universities, right? And so we're far from that. And we, as a nation, First Nations people, we need to remember that we own this country.
Eddie Cubillo, on that note, thanks so much indeed for joining me on the program, brother.
Thank you, Uncle.
For a full transcript of this interview, visit the Victorian Aboriginal News website at vicaboriginalnews.com.au. Until our next episode, stay safe and stay informed.